like it's been forever since we've
I'm
spoken.
telling you. Woo.
So welcome to your holistic life. This is part 2 of Conversations in Wellness with Dr. Kimani Borland. In part 1, we learned about a little bit about Dr. K and about naturopathic medicine and sort of what that field, that beautiful field is. But what we wanted to move into now is a conversation about diabetes. It is World Diabetes Awareness Month, and diabetes is something that is very near and dear to my heart because my mom, as long as I knew her, suffered with diabetes, and it was her ultimate demise. And I just couldn't help but think that there were things and people and healers out there that could have helped her, and she didn't need to be as sick as she was. And I think there are a lot of people in Jamaica that are on, and I'm going to call it a spectrum, because I don't think you just wake up one morning with diabetes. You kind of get there slowly. So there are people who are pre-diabetic, there are people who are borderline, there are people who are insulin resistant. Can you talk us a little bit through about, well, first of all, what is diabetes? Like, let's start real basic.
Yeah. So let's see, for purposes of simplicity, we'll just say there's 2 main types of diabetes, right? So type 1 is going to be the autoimmune one, and that's usually something that people are born with, and that's kind of a whole different beast of its own. So for the purposes of this discussion, unless you have some specific questions about type 1, let's talk about type 2 diabetes, which is the one that is a disease of our lifestyle, and is the one that is something that gets progressively worse over time if we don't do something about it, right? Which means that there's a lot of different points that we can jump in at to make sure that it's either reversed or paused in its trajectory. So it's basically a disorder of blood sugar dysregulation. So when you eat a meal and it goes into your stomach, then it goes into your intestine, then those building blocks that are broken down by the digestive system gets absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, those building blocks in the bloodstream need to come into the cells for energy. And so the problem with diabetes is that we are not able to sufficiently pull the sugar from the blood into the cell. So first, the blood sugar just gets too high, and that's primarily glucose. So there's an issue with just having hyperglycemia, and that has its own range of issues. And the pancreas releases insulin to try and pull that sugar from the blood into the cell. And then depending on where you fall on that spectrum, there's an issue with an inability to produce sufficient insulin and that kind of thing to pull the blood into the cell. So your cells are starved of energy and your blood sugar remains high.
Crazy. And what are the repercussions of this? I mean, what then happens? So I've got too much sugar in my blood.
Yeah.
Why is that a bad thing?
Yeah. So the first thing is that when too much sugar, so sugar in itself, when it stays in the blood, so if it's in the bloodstream and then it does its thing and it goes in the cell and then we use it for energy and we can whistle away with a happy life. But if it stays in the blood and it elevates in the blood, that sugar literally becomes a toxin. It becomes poisonous. Primarily, it begins to like attach to different parts of our body. So like it will attach, for example, to a blood cell, and that measurement of how many sugar molecules are on a blood cell is hemoglobin A1C. So that's actually a marker of how progressed you are in this hyperglycemic state. So it will do that to a red blood cell. Then it will go and attach to really tiny blood vessels. So that's why people with diabetes will lose their vision, or they'll lose their toe, or they'll have kidney damage, because those are the areas where there are really tiny blood vessels in abundance. So that elevated blood sugar is really problematic. So that's the blood sugar part. The insulin part, so once insulin starts to spike, so insulin's job again is that hormone that gets released to try and get sugar out of the blood and into the cell for energy. Once that starts to spike, insulin itself, and this is something that I learned in school, and it was kind of like, oh, insulin itself is a problem. So like insulin as a hormone, if it's too high, can lead to issues like it can be like a growth factor for cancers, for example. So that's one thing. And then eventually insulin is, the pancreas kind of gets tired, and the cells get tired of trying to pull all the sugar in, and the cells are no longer listening to the insulin signal, and the pancreas is no longer producing enough insulin. So we have now an issue where we're not even able to pull it into the cell. So the repercussion is that the blood sugar stays high, and the cells are starved, and they're not getting enough energy. They're not getting what they need, and that's really, really problematic.
Is that the condition known as insulin resistance?
That's correct. Okay. So insulin resistance is the state where the cell is like not the receptor, like it's not listening to insulin anymore. So insulin is shouting at it to say, pull in the sugar. And the cell is like, I'm tired of you. You've been talking to me for 20 years, like, bye. Yeah. And then, so that's insulin resistance, right? And then eventually there's a situation where there's just no more insulin. And that's the last stage of the progression of the disease, where somebody actually has to take insulin because the body is not able to produce it on its own anymore.
One thing about social media is that we like to tie up things in tight packages, right? So we've all seen memes that say sugar causes cancer, right? I think you just unlocked the science background for that sort of colloquial statement, which is that I think you said high insulin can be a growth factor for cancer. So lots of sugar in the diet will lead to high levels of insulin. High levels of insulin can cause cancer cells to grow. So there really is
that's one. Yeah, there's absolutely a correlation. That I would say is one of the correlations of many. And it's not necessarily a let's see. It is, it is more for practitioners that really understand there's a metabolic cause of cancer. In the same way there is a genetic cause of cancer, there is a hormonal endocrine cause of cancer. So there is a, acceptance that there are metabolic causes of cancer as well. And so insulin is one of those pathways. Then there are other things, right? So like if your blood sugar remains high, that directly leads to inflammation. So not I eat and I get sugar, I have sugar and then I'm healthy and I'm dealing with the sugar fine. That's fine. But once the blood sugar stays high, that literally is it leads to an inflammatory process. Like your markers of inflammation will be elevated, and inflammation itself is also an underlying cause of cancer. Right. And then thirdly, if your blood sugar remains high, that means that you are really, in the same way you're giving your cells, well, now your cells are not even able to take it in, but basically you're giving like an abundance of fuel for your cancer cells to grow, right? So there are many different mechanisms. Not all are as accepted as others, but those are some of the pathways.
Yeah, it's so incredible how so many things fit together, because we started talking about diabetes and we're talking about cancer.
Yeah.
It's just because it all ties back together. I mean, we are a holistic person there. We can't just separate these these things. So for people that don't know, a diagnosis of diabetes is not just diabetes. So you mentioned the small vessel challenges, small vessel disease. You mentioned the retinopathy, which is where the eyes, the blood vessels in the eyes, capillaries start to weaken. You've mentioned neuropathy, which is where the nerves in your feet start to burn, right? So this becomes a very uncomfortable state, not just a state of blood sugar, right? You mentioned the kidneys giving away, and the potential for amputation because things are just not reaching your extremities, blood flow and whatnot. So something else that I noticed and then I subsequently learned about is personality changes are not unusual in people with diabetes, because they have, I'm getting emotional. Because they have, why do people experience emotional changes after they've been diabetic for a while?
Yeah, so I mean, please share what, if this is something that lives in your heart and you've been really working with this, I'm sure you have some stuff to teach me. So please, the thing that's coming to me is that in the same way blood sugar is damaging to like organs and vessels, your brain is an organ and your
Great.
brain is packed with vessels.
Yeah.
And when we think about even something like dementia, that we're like, okay, why, are you just like, absolutely, there's a natural breakdown of the body. That's what the dying process is. It's not like we're needing and wanting to live forever or have that feeling like that's necessary, but there's a lot that's not necessarily inevitable, right? So if we think about what dementia is, and there is really like a breakdown of brain tissue, like there are now studies that are linking long-standing hyperglycemia with dementia, which is almost a no-brainer, no pun intended. So so basically blood sugar is damaging to neurons and blood vessels in the brain in the same way they are, and there are different parts of the brain that are responsible for personality, for so to me that that is a reasonable, understandable.
And I want people to know that if you have a diabetic in your life, take time with them as they get older, because they do get miserable or cranky or cantankerous and forgetful, because all of that's going on. With my mom, what we had realized when we did, the imaging when she was at the advanced stage in the hospital, is she had been having mini strokes and we just didn't know. They were areas, So, and because we know that diabetes, stroke, and heart.
Yes.
They form sort of an unholy
absolutely. Yes.
They all kind of got together.
Yes. So thank you for bringing that up too. So there is a lot of people. One of the most important things for people with diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, is consistent blood. You basically want the blood sugar to stay as stable as possible. So the issue with strokes and diabetes is that when we're having these huge blood sugar spikes and then these huge blood sugar falls, that's really what sets up the cascade for mini strokes to happen. So yes, this is the mini strokes and in the brain and the personality changes at the roots of it is.
So if people have diabetes in their family, right?
Yeah.
Or if they themselves have been diagnosed, to say, boy, you got to start watching what's going on here because you're trending in that direction. What's the major change? Like what should people be doing to prevent progression to this stage of a diagnosis of diabetes? Because we want to talk prevention here.
Let's do it. So one, feel empowered knowing that this is a disease of what you do. Okay, it's not who you are. It's not like you are destined for this thing. We all are given, we don't know why, but we're all given various things when we are born, and some people's challenges are more significant than others. We have different genetic imprints that help to dictate what might come up in our life. But there's a lot that we can shift and change around that, and diabetes is like the best example of that. You may have a genetic predisposition to it, but how can you step in the driver's seat of saying, okay, I'm gonna stop this in its tracks? So it's a disease of what you do, not who you are. So what do?
You're empowered.
Yeah, that is literally the first step. Okay, so because nothing will change unless you really feel that in your bones and you're able to develop the motivation and the commitment to it, because it's not easy. There's no lifestyle change that's easy. So then we just, at the very least, we start with food and we start with movement, because one of the best ways to pull sugar out of the blood is by using it. Okay, so that's encouraging it to come into the cell to be used, and it's to sensitize the cells and sensitize insulin, and movement is another thing that's doing that. So it's kind of doing both of the things on the insulin side and the blood sugar side, because of course they work together. So get moving, weights, strength training. Okay, so using weights is particularly helpful for insulin sensitizing and blood sugar regulation. So cardiovascular exercise is important for different reasons. Weight training is important for different reasons. And so for diabetes, getting moving and building muscle is really good. And then when it comes to the food, really moving away from all the things you eat normally that cause this. Okay, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So all the things, the dumpling and all the things have to stop. And
The
so
dumpling, the pasta, the bread,
all
the
of
bun
it,
and cheese.
all of that is wanting glucose, sugar.
Yeah.
Okay, all of it is just one thing. Imagine giving your body one thing with every meal, and that one thing is causing diabetes, right?
Yeah.
So that means there's a major food shift that has to happen, which is so challenging, especially when it's wrapped up into culture and it's wrapped up into finances and it's socializing, and that's a big part. So really learning food. What is a carbohydrate? What is a refined carb, a complex carbohydrates? Understanding nutrition by we have the internet now. You can learn literally from anywhere. And start really helping to not give the body the blood sugar in the first place, or the elevated blood sugar in the first place. So those are two.
Because food is so much more than fuel. Food is information to every cell in your body. And there's so many awesome resources. I mean, I know he's a medical doctor. He's an integrative practitioner, but I just love Dr. Mark Hyman.
Yeah, he's great.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, he's great. He is great.
Here I have the blood sugar solution, which I'm reading again because it's
nice.
so relevant.
I've never read that book. I've never read that book.
When you're in Jamaica next, I'll lend it to you.
Okay. Yes, I love it. Please.
It's awesome. He talks a lot about diabetes and metabolic syndrome, and then he gives you really awesome, like just supplements that are important for prevention, or if you've been diagnosed, or so
awesome.
Yeah, there are some there's a lot of junk out there, but there's also some really great resources. I think people like you and I can help people sift through the noise.
And I really think that is really my main job more than anything else. It's like, just look over here, not there, really. It's like, we do all this learning and training and education for that purpose. So we may not hold all the answers, but at the very least we can say, just look here. Pointing people to resources is really a big part of our job.
So in prevention, you spoke about feeling empowered, and then you spoke about movement and food, right? Food, kind of getting rid of the things that cause the blood sugar spikes, and then movement, making sure we have both cardio and strength training, because they both play a role. And I'd love to include flexibility training in there because of the meditation and the yoga, and just kind of, because stress plays a role in this whole thing.
Yes, absolutely.
What if I've been diagnosed with diabetes and I don't want to take the glucophage, the metformin, the insulin injections? Do I have a choice? Like, what can I do?
So the longer you
and I know that this is not, you're not diagnosing and you're not giving out advice. This is just a conversation.
Yes.
And people are not meant to act on this right away without
disclaimers. And you know what? Every time I'm like, oh, you have this information, you want to share it. And so even recently on my most recent post, I gave one suggestion for one particular herb, and the questions came in. I'm like, oh, it's so hard because it's so individual. It's really hard to make general statements. So the longer you have the disease and the more progressed you are, the harder it is to reverse. So you absolutely can reverse prediabetes, 100%. You absolutely can reverse the beginning stages of diabetes. But the longer you have it, 5 years, 10 years, and for sure, once you progress to taking insulin, it's very difficult to fully backtrack there, any at all. At the very least, you can stop progression further from that point. And then I like to remind people that there's a whole range of other ways that you can support the body outside of just the blood sugar insulin situation. For example, we know that the kidneys are going to get susceptible. How can we help to protect the kidneys with herbs? or we know neuropathy is a debilitating symptom that there's no real medication that can touch it effectively. How can we help to support neuropathy, support brain health, and that kind of thing, right? So we're whole people. So how can we use our natural therapeutics to support the body, even if it's at whatever stage of illness that it's at? So the question was, okay, so let's assume that we're in let's assume that we're in this stage and states where we have some reversibility, we have a little bit of control of how we want this disease to progress or not. Then we use herbs. So how I kind of my natural therapeutics I put in the category of like nutrients. So it's like, we know food is medicine, but if we're at a stage where we are having a disease, we kind of want to ramp up those medicinal components of food in the form of supplements. So I love using supplements because to me they represent meeting the pathology where it's at. So if you're in pre-diabetes, we may not need to use any supplements at all. Actually, we don't need to, right? So that's part of naturopathic medicine, is a therapeutic word on knowing when to use what when. So once you become, let's say you're in stage 1, then you can use supplements or nutrients. So as an example, chromium is one of those one of those micronutrients that have been found to support blood sugar regulation. Okay, so that's just an example. There are many. Then so that's like the nutrient category. And then there's a herbs category. Okay, so there are certain herbs that help to sensitize insulin. So that's going to be something like cinnamon, or there's certain herbs that like directly help to lower blood sugar. That would be something like berberine. So there is a whole world, and this is a world that herbalists study. This is a world that naturopathic doctors study to understand what natural therapeutics are most relevant, what dose, what concentration, what length of time. And it's going to be so specific to what you are going through.
Awesome. I think you just completely gave us a door into why, if we have concerns, we need to come and talk to you, because I love what you said, that if we're pre-diabetic, we can completely reverse.
Yeah.
And if we're early diabetes, there's a lot we can do, and the longer it hangs around. So we don't need to be afraid. We don't need to feel that we're enslaved to our genetic predispositions. A diagnosis does not mean death. We can, and we don't have to succumb to medication for the rest of our lives. There are lifestyle changes, and with people like you in our lives, then we can overcome this thing and not make it be a problem. Right?
Yes, and remember, it's a progressive disease, so it's not like there's certain conditions that are urgent, emergency. Get on the blood, get on medication right now. But this is not something you get a diagnosis, and again, it's a death sentence, or even you will even know immediately. Like you wouldn't even know if you didn't go to the doctor, right? So it's not something to fear your life for, right? It is something that if you've had it for 15 years, then that's when we get into life, death, like significant morbidity. So that's more about your quality of life, mortality versus mortality, that kind of.
Dr. K, you're awesome as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, fun. I live for these conversations.
Thank you so much. Yes. And if people want to reach out to you directly, it's www.wellnesswithdrk.com. Or they can find you on your Instagram, which will be tagged in this post.
Lovely.
And that's awesome. Keep doing what you do, and keep
being
awesome
girl.
Girl that you are.
And thanks for being my continued support for me professionally, for all the clients that we work with. It's always a teamwork. So try and find yourself practitioners of any kind that are willing to work together and form a team for you, right? So that we can all help you. That's the goal. Not about who.
Play roles. It's a tribe. It's a family.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Kimani.
All right, girl. Talk to you soon.